October 25th, 1415. A cold, muddy field in northern France. On one side stood 6,000 exhausted, half-starved English soldiers, many of them sick and barely able to stand. On the other, over 20,000 well-fed, heavily armored French knights and men-at-arms, confident and eager for an easy victory. The odds? Completely one-sided. But what happened next would shock Europe and echo through history for centuries as one of the most unexpected triumphs in medieval warfare. How did King Henry V lead his outnumbered, sickly army to one of the most stunning victories ever recorded? What secret weapon allowed common English archers to bring down the flower of French nobility? And how did the terrain itself turn into a death trap for the powerful French cavalry? This is not just a story of swords and arrows. It's a story of brilliant strategy, blind arrogance, desperate courage, and the brutal reality of medieval warfare where fate turned on inches of mud and moments of hesitation. To understand Agincourt, we first need to step back into the brutal conflict that led here, the 100 Years' War, a bitter generations-long struggle for the crown of France. In 1415, Henry V would risk everything to claim his place in history. The Battle of Agincourt didn't happen overnight. Its roots run deep into a century-long conflict that would bleed both England and France dry, the 100 Years' War. It all began with a royal dispute. The French king died without a direct male heir. England's King Edward III, through his mother's French lineage, claimed the throne of France. But the French nobility rejected his claim, crowning Philip VI instead. What followed was a series of brutal wars, shattered treaties and devastating raids that ravaged towns, emptied royal treasuries and caused untold suffering across both kingdoms. By 1415, the war had dragged on for nearly 80 years. The French were divided. Feuding between the Armagnacs and Burgundians left their leadership fractured. Meanwhile, in England, a young, ambitious king had just ascended the throne, Henry V. To secure his authority at home, distract his restless nobility, and revive his country's claim, Henry turned his gaze across the Channel. For Henry, war was not only about claims or politics, it was personal legacy. Victory abroad would cement his rule and elevate his name among England's great kings, but it was a gamble. England's resources were strained, and the kingdom faced mounting debts. In August 1415, Henry launched his bold campaign. His first objective, capture the strategic port of Harfleur on the Norman coast. But the siege dragged on far longer than anticipated. Disease swept through the English camp. Dysentery, known as the Bloody Flux, decimated his army, leaving many soldiers too weak to fight. When Harfleur finally surrendered, after weeks of brutal fighting, Henry's forces were depleted, demoralized, and physically broken. Despite these heavy losses, Henry made a daring decision. Rather than retreat to England immediately, he led his remaining forces on a dangerous march toward the English-held stronghold of Calais. The goal was simple: reach safety and regroup. But the French were waiting. As Henry's weakened army marched through hostile territory, the French mobilized a massive force to intercept him. Roads were blocked, bridges were destroyed, French scouts shadowed the English every step of the way. Supplies dwindled. The soldiers, marching over 260 miles, endured cold nights, hunger, sickness, and constant fear of ambush. By late October, Henry's battered army found itself cornered near a small village called Agincourt. Outnumbered and trapped, the English king had no choice but to stand and fight. The stage was set for one of history's most improbable victories. The site chosen for the confrontation was as unlikely as the battle itself. Near the village of Agincourt, the narrow strip of land where Henry would make his stand was flanked by dense woods on both sides, the Bois de Azincourt and Bois de Tramcourt. The French, confident in their overwhelming numbers, saw no danger in this confined terrain, but for Henry it was a battlefield perfectly suited for his smaller force. The field was barely 700 yards wide, far too narrow for the massive French cavalry and heavy infantry to properly deploy. The French plan relied on overwhelming charges, but here their troops would be funneled into tight ranks, vulnerable to bottlenecking and confusion. Worse still, the autumn rains had soaked the freshly ploughed farmland for days, turning the ground into a sticky, heavy quagmire. The thick clay soil clung to the feet of men and the hooves of horses, sapping their strength and slowing every movement even before battle was joined. Henry arranged his army with tactical brilliance. At the center were his heavily armored men-at-arms, knights, nobles, and seasoned soldiers, prepared for brutal hand-to-hand combat. But the real force multiplier stood on either flank. More than 5,000 English and Welsh longbowmen, each armed with the powerful English longbow. Crafted from yew wood, these bows could launch arrows at tremendous speed, puncturing armor and cutting down advancing forces long before they could close the distance. To shield his archers from cavalry assaults, Henry ordered long, sharpened wooden stakes, called palings, to be driven into the ground at an angle. These created lethal barriers that would impale charging horses and disrupt any frontal assault. The terrain, the mud, the woods, and the palings all combined to turn the battlefield itself into a deadly trap. What the French expected to be a quick and decisive victory was about to become a disaster. Under grey, brooding skies, both armies stood locked in silence. The air was thick with tension. The fate of nations would soon be decided in the mud of Agincourt. As dawn broke on October 25th, both armies finally stared each other down across the muddy fields. The contrast between the two forces could not have been more stark. Two different worlds preparing for a single, bloody collision. On the English side stood around 6,000 men, roughly half of them archers armed with longbows, the rest a mix of knights, men-at-arms, and lightly armored infantry. Many were weakened by weeks of hunger, sickness, and the exhausting march through hostile territory. Their armor was simpler, lighter, and more practical for the conditions they faced. But their spirits were hardened like steel. Survival was their only path forward. Behind them was no escape, only the hope that Henry's leadership, God's favor, and the battlefield itself would deliver them. The French army, by comparison, looked like the very embodiment of medieval might. Estimates suggest between 12,000 to 20,000 soldiers, including some of the most powerful nobles in Europe. The finest knights in polished plate armor stood proudly at the front, their colorful banners fluttering in the wind. Behind them, rows of heavily armed crossbowmen, pikemen, and waves of reinforcements waited for the signal to advance. They were well-fed, well-equipped, and supremely confident. For many, this seemed less like a battle and more like a formality before victory. But beneath the glittering armor, the French suffered from dangerous overconfidence and poor coordination. Nobles argued over precedence: who would lead the charge, who would take prisoners, who would reap the riches of ransom. The chain of command was disjointed and chaotic even before the first arrows flew. Henry V, fully aware of his army's vulnerability, personally walked among his troops that morning, speaking directly to his men. His words, later immortalized by Shakespeare as the Band of Brothers speech, inspired unity, courage, and a shared sense of destiny among soldiers of all ranks. Psychologically, the gap between the two armies was widening. The English were desperate but disciplined, united by necessity, and led with clear purpose. The French were numerous but disorganized, driven more by pride, profit, and personal ambition. Both sides knew the clash was inevitable. The French waited, hoping to bait the English into breaking formation. But Henry held his ground, refusing to move. Hours passed, and the already soaked field grew deeper with mud as thousands of hooves and boots churned the ground into a thick, treacherous swamp. Finally, as patience snapped and pride overcame caution, the French launched their advance. The battle that would change history was about to erupt. The French advance began with a slow, determined march. Thousands of armored knights and men-at-arms moved forward, their polished plate gleaming dully beneath the grey autumn skies. But from the very first steps, the battlefield itself betrayed them. The sodden, freshly ploughed farmland had become a sea of thick, clinging mud. Each heavy step sank deep, turning every forward movement into an exhausting, painful struggle. Horses stumbled, knights slipped, and entire formations wavered as the narrow field funneled them into dense, vulnerable columns, tightly packed and exposed. Then came the storm of arrows. From either flank, the English longbowmen unleashed a relentless rain of death. Firing up to 10 arrows per minute, thousands of lethal shafts darkened the sky. The longbow's incredible range and power allowed them to strike the French long before they could retaliate. Armor-piercing bodkin points found their marks, penetrating mail, slipping through gaps in plate and bringing down both men and horses in droves. The front ranks buckled under the pressure. Fallen horses crushed soldiers beneath them, while disoriented knights struggled to keep their footing in the worsening mire. The thick mud transformed the field into a horrifying killing ground. Men suffocated beneath the weight of bodies, drowned in the muck, or were trampled by panicked comrades. The harder the French pushed forward, the worse the carnage became. Desperate to break through, the French finally reached the English line. Brutal, hand-to-hand combat erupted, swords clashed, maces smashed, and axes tore through armor at brutal close quarters. Yet the narrow front denied the French their overwhelming advantage in numbers. Only the first ranks could fight, while the mass behind them stood helpless, unable to reach the fray. Meanwhile, the English longbowmen, having exhausted their arrows, joined the melee. Lightly armored and agile, they closed in with mallets, swords, and daggers striking at weak points in the French armor, targeting exposed faces, necks, and joints with deadly precision. The battle descended into a scene of horrific slaughter. The French elite, weighed down by their armor and trapped in the mud, became easy prey. Attempts to reinforce the front only added to the chaos, turning the field into a mountain of fallen men and horses. By midday, the French assault had completely unraveled. Thousands lay dead or dying, with many more captured or surrendering. The English lines remarkably remained intact, their losses minimal in comparison to the devastation they had inflicted. Against every expectation, the smaller, weaker English army had annihilated one of the most powerful noble forces in Europe. The impossible had happened. The Battle of Agincourt was more than a victory. It was a turning point in medieval warfare. The longbow's power, Henry's leadership, and French overconfidence rewrote the rules of battle. Though the 100 Years' War dragged on, Agincourt became a symbol of the underdog defying impossible odds. It secured Henry V's legacy and shifted Europe's balance of power. Even today, over 600 years later, Agincourt remains one of history's most astonishing triumphs. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more epic historical documentaries. This is History Replay This Day.